Hey, so tonight we'll drift into a quiet world of creaky stalls and alley cats, glazed teacups and roasted chestnuts, silk-wrapped bundles and gossip whispered under paper lanterns. Dim your lights if they're still on. Let the soft glow of your screen be the last little ember. Settle under your blanket or that heavy old quilt you only bring out when the evenings carry a yawn in the breeze. Maybe you've got a warm drink nearby. Maybe not. It's okay. We're just here to rest. If this calm journey helps you unwind, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure, just quiet company. Our story tonight begins not with a bang or a battle, but with a small wooden sign in 17th century Korea, a little ink brush drawing of a sleeping cat. That cat, my friend, sold more than naps. Let me tell you about one particular corner of 17th century Hanyang, the capital of the Joseon dynasty, what we now call Seoul. You might think a cat merchant would run a bustling animal stall with meows echoing from bamboo cages, but that would be far too straightforward. This was no cat breeder. No, this merchant simply had a painted cat on a worn wooden placard, dangling from a rusty iron hook outside his shop. The shop's name? Soft Paw Sundries. It didn't sell cats. Not really. Maybe once in a while a stray kitten would be handed off to a child in exchange for a copper coin, but that wasn't the heart of the business. The cat was simply a symbol of what? Ah, that's where it gets curious. On your left as you enter, a faint aroma greets you. Not the sharp, fishy tang you might expect. No sardines here. It's more of a slow-roasted chestnut, the kind that crumbles when your thumb presses against the shell. Imagine the light puff of steam that escapes as you peel one open on a chilly morning. That was the first surprise for travellers looking for literal cats. They came for claws and left with snacks. The merchant himself, a thin man in a faded blue hanbok with frayed cuffs and permanently smudged spectacles, was named Yu Seok. Yu Seok had a voice like rice simmering in a clay pot. Gentle, bubbling, almost inaudible unless you leaned in. "Looking for the tabby? We sold her to the tea woman down the hill," he'd whisper, nudging a small wooden tray of peculiar sweets your way. "But I do have this." He'd lift the cloth from a platter of sticky jujube rice cakes. Not too sweet, not too chewy, a cross between a gummy bear and a polite hug. You'd never see them on a menu, but people remembered them. Now, here's the trick. Yu Seok didn't bake, nor did he own a kitchen, but every morning at sunrise he walked through the old laundry alleys near the stream, bowing politely to the grandmothers who soaked radishes in ceramic vats. Then he'd knock 3 times, tap, 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 on a nondescript wooden door near the apothecary. From behind it, a tray of mystery goods would appear, wrapped in silk the colour of moonlight. He never revealed who made the snacks. Rumours swirled, of course. One theory claimed his snacks were actually the failed offerings from a retired palace chef who got tired of ceremonies and turned to private commissions. Another whispered that Yu Seok's aunt was a Buddhist nun who ran a secret kitchen at the base of Mountain Wangsan, using pine needles and wild sesame to flavour her peace. But perhaps the most persistent theory came from the local children, that the snacks were whispered into being by the shop cat itself, who merely stared at empty dishes and made things appear. Because sometimes, Yu Seok wasn't in the shop, but the snacks were. The kettle whistled, the low hum of a lullaby vibrated through the floorboards, and the cat, oh yes, the cat, never once touched the sardines left at her bowl. She preferred roasted squash seeds and dried persimmon slivers. You see, Soft Paw Sundries wasn't about cats at all. It was about comfort. It was where the mailman bought a pine-flavoured candy to chew on his route, where widows sipped barley tea from cups slightly chipped at the rim, cups that felt like old friends. It was where gossip came with honeyed biscuits and old songs returned on the breeze. One day, a scholar from the provinces visited the shop looking for a cat. His hat was far too big and his shoes had mud from a 3-day walk. He carried a scroll of laws but secretly wanted a nap. Yu Seok looked up and said, "The cat just stepped out, but I do have these peach rice pillows. They're filled with air and small regrets. Perfect for forgetting imperial exams." The scholar smiled for the first time in weeks. So what did the cat merchant really sell? Softness, and a reason to pause. Let your mind wander now. from that narrow wooden shop down the cobbled alley where cats blink slowly at the sun, and into the next tale. Now, if you've never seen ginseng that looks like a baby, you might think I'm exaggerating. But in 17th century Korea, nestled in the folds of damp mulberry paper, some roots really did resemble tiny, wrinkled toddlers, arms curled in, legs folded as if mid-stretch, and soft-paw sundries? Well, it somehow ended up with a whole basket of them, though of course Yuseok insisted they weren't for sale. Too moody, he'd murmur, rearranging them each morning like fussy guests at a quiet party. They liked the window, east-facing. And that was that. People came just to see them. Merchants on break, tired monks, a wandering musician with a cracked zither, all leaning in to stare at the odd, vaguely humanoid roots lounging in a bowl like spa-goers. One even had a sprig of moss on its head. Local legend whispered that if you looked too long they blinked back. But Yuseok wasn't selling roots. Not really. The ginseng sat in that bowl for months, somehow never shriveling. No one knew where he got them. He once claimed they were a gift from a mountain shaman with frostbitten eyebrows. Another time, he hinted they simply arrived one rainy night with the milk delivery. He opened the door and there they were, nestled beside a soggy fish catalogue and a beetle. What Yuseok actually offered, behind the ginseng display beside the faded scrolls of lucky poetry, was a curious little treat he called morning bundles. Imagine biting into a dumpling filled with warm mashed pear, sticky rice and black sesame, all wrapped in a whisper-thin slice of pickled radish. Sweet and tangy, little odd, little addictive, kind of like biting into a dream you didn't mean to have. They were wrapped like newborns, tiny fabric bundles with thread bows, and each one had a name. Not written, no, just whispered. You'd take one from the tray and Yuseok would lean in and say, "Ah, that one's called Left Too Early," or "She's named Rain on exam day." You'd chuckle, then you'd bite, and just like that you'd remember something you didn't know you'd forgotten. The magistrate's assistant once claimed the bundles cured his hiccups. A silkworm farmer said they made his dreams smell like his mother's kitchen. Even the town's grumpiest blacksmith admitted, only once over barley wine, that the treat stopped time for a second. But the ginseng, still not for sale, it became a sort of shop pet. Someone knitted a scarf one winter. A child gave it a name, Mr. Chudang. A cat once battered it off the shelf, and Yuseok scolded her like she'd tipped over a monk. Eventually, people stopped asking why the cat merchant had ginseng that looked like babies. It became part of the ritual. You bowed at the door, breathed in the smell of roasted grains, and nodded at Mr. Chudang as if greeting a sleepy uncle. In return, you got a dumpling wrapped in a memory, and if you stayed long enough, sometimes the cat curled up beside you. And sometimes, if the wind hit the roof just right, you could hear Yuseok humming lullabies to the roots. They never blinked, but they listened. Now, let your eyes relax. Picture that quiet shop with the ginseng by the window. Let the image fade like steam from a kettle and drift softly into the next tale. Let me take you to a late autumn afternoon in Yuseok's shop, the kind where the sky had already turned a pale grey and the clouds looked like woolen socks, damp and ready to be hung. The floor creaked louder than usual, as though each wooden plank had its own complaints about the cold. Yuseok, wrapped in 2 robes and a scarf made from a repurposed rice sack, was carefully arranging a new tray at the corner of the tea table. The tray held exactly 6 pickled plums, no more, no less. Each nestled in a bed of dried chrysanthemum petals. These weren't ordinary plums. They were so small, so densely shriveled, they looked like they'd been scalded by the sun. But they gleamed with a lacquer of plum vinegar and honey, aged until their flavour was almost philosophical. There was a rumour, silly maybe, but persistent, that if you ate one and could keep your face entirely neutral, no eye twitch, no lip pucker, your heart's desire would come true by sundown. Naturally, this attracted all sorts. On that chilly afternoon, it brought in a calligraphy student named Ji Hae and a young paper merchant named Cheol. They didn't know they'd arrived at the same time, but they did. Both drawn in by the posted sign, "Limited batch, emotional plums available today." Cheol stood by the door, still brushing flakes of bark from his sleeve. Ji-hye was already seated at the table, notebook open, her brush twirling between fingers like she was waiting for inspiration to walk in. Yoo-seok, ever the quiet puppeteer of serendipity, simply poured 2 cups of warm quince tea and placed a plum on each saucer. "Just one bite," he said, no flinching. They looked at each other, then at the plums. Ji-hye raised an eyebrow. Cheol nodded solemnly. Together they bit. The shop held its breath. Ji-hye blinked twice but smiled. Cheol hiccuped, then said, "It's like a lemon fell in love with an old raisin and they had a philosophical disagreement." She laughed, and that was it. From then on, they returned every week, always on Thursdays. They never admitted it was because of the plum, but they always asked if any were left. Sometimes there were, sometimes not. But they came anyway, and Yoo-seok made sure the table was swept, the tea was hot, and the cat was well behaved. By the 3rd month, Cheol brought Ji-hye a folded paper crane with tiny ink characters written on its wings. "Would you sit with me forever?" Yoo-seok pretended not to see it. The cat, however, sat directly on the crane, which, in shop language, meant yes. They were married by spring, not in a palace, not even in a temple, but in the alley outside the shop under a laundry line hung with celebratory silks. Guests were served pickled plums on skewers, half puckered, half cried. Everyone agreed it was a perfect wedding. Yoo-seok added 1 more plum to the tray the next week, just in case someone else walked in needing a reason. Because it was never really about selling things. Not really. It was about what people found while looking for cats. So let your mind drift now. Let the soft hum of an autumn breeze ruffle the paper lanterns in your imagination. Imagine the plum's tanginess dancing across your tongue and let yourself float gently into the next story. Now, most people wouldn't expect a chicken to get emotional over a biscuit. But this was no ordinary biscuit, and certainly no ordinary chicken. The biscuit in question was about the size of a copper coin, flat and round with delicate pressed designs on top. Small flower patterns, each one slightly off-center, as if hand-stamped by someone distracted by a breeze. The base was made of glutinous rice flour, toasted golden on one side like it had kissed the bottom of a clay pan. Its scent, like roasted rice mixed with a memory of honey. Yoo-seok called them nestlets. No one knew why. Maybe because they were comforting, or maybe because he always placed them on tiny straw mats, like they needed somewhere warm to sit. And now for the chicken. She wasn't part of the shop, per se. She belonged to a travelling vegetable vendor named Mrs. Bae, who often wandered the alley with baskets of scallions, eggplants, and once a cucumber shaped exactly like a question mark. She kept the chicken in a loose sling across her back like a sleepy baby. The chicken's name was Ryeon. One particularly slow morning, while Yoo-seok was steeping a new barley root tea that tasted suspiciously like baked socks, Mrs. B.A. stopped by to warm her feet. She was muttering about frostbitten eggplants and cursed cabbage leaves when she sat the chicken down on the bench. Ryeon wandered over to the biscuit tray. She didn't peck, she didn't squawk, she just stared. Yoo-seok noticed, of course. "Ah," he said, crouching beside her. "That one smells like cornfields. Reminds you of home?" The chicken blinked. "I used to know a rooster like you," Yoo-seok continued. "He had a limp and loved dumpling soup." At that, Ryeon let out a low, warbly sound, a sort of trilled coo, and, well, if you ask Mrs. Bae, a tear rolled down her feathered cheek. Just one, a very small, sincere bead of saltwater emotion. Yoo-seok naturally offered her a biscuit. She didn't eat it, just warmed her feet beside it, as if content to simply be near something that understood. From then on, nestlets became known as the kind biscuit. Not because they were especially sweet. In truth, they were rather plain, but they had this way of sitting softly on the tongue, the kind of treat that didn't ask for attention, just presence, like a background melody you didn't realize was your favorite until it disappeared. Travelers began buying them in bundles, not to eat but to give to others. A biscuit for the tired postmaster, one for the boy afraid of horses, one left at the temple for ancestors who might still feel hunger in dreams. They became tokens of quiet care, of unsaid things. Yoo-seok never raised the price. "Emotions are cheap today," he'd say, sweeping his sleeve across the tea table. "Help yourself." The cat naturally ignored the biscuits. She preferred to nap inside the empty straw baskets afterward. Nestlets, indeed. So the biscuit that made a chicken cry found its place. Not on royal menus, not in cookbooks, but in pockets, wrapped in cotton scraps, warming fingers through the long, quiet walks home. And sometimes, on the slowest mornings, Yuseok would leave one on the windowsill with a small note tucked beneath, for whoever needed this more than they realized. Now, imagine the biscuit on your tongue, warm, soft, with the faintest crunch at the edge. Let it melt into stillness. Let your thoughts slow to the rhythm of a chicken's quiet breathing. And when you're ready, let's wander gently into the next tale. It was midwinter when the governor's assistant first wandered into Soft-Paw Sundries. His boots were too shiny, and his top knot too carefully combed, signs that he wasn't used to back alleys and floor creaks. But the governor had sent him with a task, to find the source of the paper-thin seaweed squares with the smell of moonlit salt. The governor had tasted one apparently during a moon-viewing party hosted by his poet cousin. The cousin, half drunk on pine-infused rice wine, claimed they were found only where the cats are fat and the tea tastes like old riddles. Naturally, the governor was intrigued, and governors don't just get curious, they get determined. The assistant arrived with a scroll, an official seal, and the distinct air of someone who hadn't knelt on a woven mat since childhood. Yuseok, without even looking up, handed him a porcelain plate with 3 sheets of roasted seaweed delicately folded like fan blades. "Governor's orders?" he asked softly. The assistant blinked. "Yes, for the, rare snack. You sell cats, yes?" "Only metaphorically," Yuseok replied. The assistant didn't know what to make of that, so he sat down and took a bite. It cracked like a whisper, lightly salted, barely oiled, and faintly smoked, as if it had passed through a chimney full of gentle stories. The texture, crisp, then dissolving, was like a snowflake with ambition. He blinked again, this time slower. Yuseok poured tea without a word. "You made this?" the assistant asked, uncertain. "Hardly," Yuseok said, wiping the rim of the teapot. "It's a collaboration between the tide, the wind, and a very particular widow who dries things on her roof in the shape of poetry." The assistant wrote that down. But here's where things got interesting. The assistant returned to the governor with a sample, except he accidentally brought a piece of mulberry paper instead of the actual snack. Still, the governor loved it. He bit into the paper, yes, actually bit it, and declared it a refined texture with hints of nostalgia and salt. He ate the whole thing, wax seal and all, convinced it was avant-garde cuisine. From that day forward, he became an accidental fan of edible paper. Yuseok, upon hearing this, simply smiled. From then on, he wrapped every seaweed order for the governor in delicate calligraphy paper. The seaweed was eaten by the assistant. The paper was savoured by the governor. Both were satisfied. And in a way, everyone was right. Because taste is as much imagination as it is tongue. Back in the shop, the seaweed snack became a quiet legend. Travellers came to try the square that fooled a nobleman. And Yuseok began rotating flavours. Lavender-scented oil, dusted soybean, even one laced with dried plum powder. None were flashy. All were subtle. The kind of taste that made you pause, then nod, then wonder if you could ever find it again. He never named them. "You'll call it what you need," he'd say, handing over a wrapped square. Even the cat got involved. She once battered a sheet into the brazier, where it briefly fluttered like a moth before vanishing in a flash of sea-scented smoke. Yuseok called it performance art. So what did the cat merchant sell? Confidence in flavours, in stories, in letting people believe what they tasted, even when it was just poetry on rice paper. Now close your eyes, imagine a crackle on your tongue, the whisper of tide, breeze and salt. Let it carry you like driftwood to the next story. Not every merchant sold light in the form of flame, and certainly not in the form of old broth. But then again, Yuseok's little sundry shop never quite followed expected rules. Let me set the scene. It was the kind of winter day where the sunlight seemed to apologise for showing up. The sky was all parchment smudges, and the wind didn't howl, it muttered like a half-awake uncle. The scent of fermented bean paste drifted over the rooftops, clinging to everything like a fog made of lunch. Inside Softpaw Sundries, the kettle clinked softly, and the cat was curled in a perfect spiral on top of the dictionary. That day, Yusiok was polishing a row of odd-shaped candles. Some were twisted like dragon's tails, others squat and square like tofu, but the most peculiar one was round with a flat top and the faint scent, believe it or not, of slow-simmered beef radish soup. He called it memory stew. When asked why, Yusiok simply said, "Because everyone remembers a bowl they didn't finish." The candle wasn't meant to be eaten, of course, but its smell was so uncanny, so precisely nostalgic, that people swore they tasted turnip on their tongue after sniffing it. One visitor, a retired musician with only 3 teeth, claimed he hadn't cried in 20 years until he smelled the candle. "It reminded me of my aunt's porch and the bowl I broke that one spring," he whispered, eyes misty. Another woman insisted it was the exact scent of her son's first hangover meal. And one child, after a long sniff, nodded solemnly and said, "Smells like secrets." Yusiok sold exactly 1 per day, no more, because as he explained, too much nostalgia could cause indigestion of the soul. Each candle came wrapped in wax paper with a single chopstick tied to it, not a pair. Just one. Because longing is never balanced, he'd say, tapping the counter with a thin stick. He didn't make them himself. They were delivered by a man who smelled like sandalwood and rain. This man never spoke. Just nodded once, placed the candles in a reed basket, and vanished down the alley. Yusiok always nodded back, as if they'd agreed on a price without ever using numbers. Now, the cat, she hated the candle. Every time one was lit, she would glare at it, hiss once, and jump to the top shelf as if offended by the emotional humidity. Some said she once knocked one over into a bowl of millet tea. The room apparently smelled like poor decisions for a week. But the people kept coming. The candle's glow was nothing special. Its wick burned low with a blue-tinged flame. But it was the warmth it summoned. Not to the fingers, but to the throat. That invisible lump, that quiet tightening, that moment of being full with something you couldn't name. One young man came back 6 times to sniff it without buying. The 7th time he left a poem. It read, "Your soup waits in a house that no longer stands. I lit your scent in silence. Now I carry your kitchen in my sleeves." Yusiok pinned the poem behind the counter. No title, no signature. And when the candle melted down to its end, its wick would briefly spark like the pop of ginger in hot oil, before vanishing. The smell? It lingered just a little, just long enough to make you look over your shoulder. So, what did the cat merchant sell that day? A hunger you didn't realize you still had. Let your body soften now. Imagine the dim flicker of a soup-scented flame dancing on the wooden shelf. Let its warmth curl around your shoulders and carry you gently into the next tale. The thing about tea is that it often pretends to be simple, just hot water and leaves. But in Softpaw Sundries, even the water seemed to remember stories. On this particular morning, a drizzle tapped softly against the paper windows. Not a real rain, more like a polite mist asking to come in. The cat had wedged herself into the rice bin again, likely in protest of the colder floorboards. And Yusiok was stirring something unusual in a ceramic pot shaped like a sleeping goose. He didn't offer the tea. He just poured 2 small cups and placed them on the table. One for you, one for someone you weren't ready to forgive. The label on the pot read only, "For sorry days." No ingredients, no instructions. When you lifted the cup, it smelled faintly of toasted buckwheat, tangerine peel, and something oddly metallic like tears caught in a copper bowl. The first sip, soft, almost shy. The flavour hovered somewhere between warm paper and the inside of a coat collar in winter. A visitor once said it tasted like the end of an argument you wished hadn't started. Another said it reminded them of the moment after you drop a bowl but before it shatters. It wasn't bitter, not quite, but it had a thickness, a pause, a kind of slow, swirling warmth that sat on the tongue and made you think, maybe I was wrong. Yusiok only served it on days when the wind came from the west. If the breeze is too sharp, he explained, the tea forgets how to be gentle. No one ever bought the tea. It wasn't on display. It simply appeared like a sigh. and it was never requested out loud. You just had to sit quietly, shoulders a little slumped, and look out the window like you were waiting for someone who wouldn't arrive. That's when Yusyok knew. One rainy evening, a father and daughter came in. They didn't speak to each other. They chose opposite ends of the room. Yusyok served them the tea. Neither touched it for a long while. Then, without a word, the daughter picked up her cup and raised it slightly, just enough for the father to notice. He did the same. They drank. And when they left, the air smelled a little lighter, as if the tea had taken something heavy and folded it away. Afterward, Yusyok collected their cups and poured the leftover tea into a small crack behind the shop. "It helps the weeds forgive the frost," he whispered, mostly to himself. Even the cat, usually indifferent to ceremony, curled around the empty pot that night and slept there. People began to speak of it in hushed tones. "He served me the tea," they'd say. No further explanation needed. And slowly, quietly, the shop became a place where apologies floated between cups and steam carried regret away on the wind. So what did the cat merchant really sell? Moments, second chances, sips of softness in a world often too sharp. Now, let your breath slow. Imagine the warmth of a teacup in your hands. Feel it melt through your fingers into your chest and settle somewhere just behind your heart. And when you're ready, let's drift into the next quiet corner of the shop. You know how some sweets try to charm you? With frills and glazes and names that sound like royal horses? Not this one. Yusyok's taffy didn't sparkle. It didn't stretch in long, glossy ribbons like the street vendors pulled near the market square. No fanfare. No sesame showers. Just stubby chunks wrapped in crinkled brown paper, tied at the ends like the sort of secret you try not to admit to anyone. The cat refused to sit near them. She'd hiss if one unwrapped too close to her nap spot. And maybe she was right to be cautious. Because this taffy, chewy, slow-melting and faintly flavoured with burnt soy and perilla root, had a peculiar side effect. It made people confess. No, really, one bite and your thoughts turned slippery. Guarded hearts became leaky boats. An herbalist once chewed it absent-mindedly and whispered, "I haven't liked ginseng since I was 12, but I've been pretending for social purposes." His assistant just nodded sympathetically. A well-dressed scholar tried one while browsing for inkstones and suddenly muttered, "I lied about reading the Analects. I just skimmed." A young monk bit into it and mumbled through sticky teeth, "I don't actually enjoy silence. I hum when no one's looking." Yusyok never explained how the recipe worked. He only called it plain truth taffy. He made it in small batches and always at night, when even the lanterns seemed to whisper instead of glow. Boiled in a shallow pot that was older than any customer, stirred with a spoon rumoured to be carved from a peach tree that only bore fruit during eclipses. The recipe? Hidden, of course. One theory suggested the syrup was infused with fermented water from beneath a truth stone near the mountains. Another said Yusyok whispered personal secrets into the sugar as it thickened, like a chant that gave it flavour, but Yusyok himself? He just smiled. "It's not magic," he'd say. "It's just flavour that forgets how to lie." People didn't eat it casually. You had to be ready, or reckless, or maybe both. One couple, known for their perfect courtship, each bit a piece at the same time. She confessed she hated his flute playing. He admitted he never actually liked her poetry. There was a long silence, then laughter. Big, messy, biscuit crumb laughter. They got married 3 weeks later. The taffy didn't ruin things. It clarified them. Even the cat, though wary, was once spotted sniffing a wrapped piece and sighing. A long theatrical sigh. Children loved it, of course. Not because of its honesty, but because of the challenge. How many chews before you said something weird? A boy once made it to 6 before admitting he'd hidden 6 boiled chestnuts in his pillowcase. They needed a soft place, he explained. So what did the cat merchant sell? Freedom. The kind that comes wrapped in chewy discomfort and ends with unexpected relief. Now, loosen your jaw. Imagine a slow, sticky sweetness unfolding across your tongue. Let the taste of quiet truth settle behind your teeth and allow your mind to melt gently into the next tale. This wasn't food, strictly speaking, but in Softpaw Sundries, not everything that healed you had to go in your mouth. some comforts wrapped around your shoulders instead. The scarf in question wasn't hanging on a rack or folded in neat piles. It was draped over the back of an old chair no one ever sat in. A pale grey thing with a loose hand-knitted weave, loops uneven, threads frayed at the edges like an old thought you've carried too long in your pocket. Yusiok never mentioned it, not once, but sometimes, when a visitor looked particularly hollow-eyed or carried their sadness too tightly around their spine, he would wordlessly lift the scarf and lay it across their shoulders. And they always paused, then blinked, then breathed. "It smells like," they'd begin and then fall silent. Everyone smelled something different. One old woman said it carried the scent of her husband's winter jacket, the one he wore every New Year until the year he didn't. A travelling fishmonger said it reminded him of the laundry soap his mother used before she lost her hands to frostbite. A shy widow muttered lavender and something like warm rice. She didn't say another word the whole time she was there. Some people smelled rain on paper. Others claimed to catch notes of charcoal smoke, citron tea, or even the faint whiff of childhood scoldings. Yusiok claimed it wasn't enchanted. Just well-seasoned fabric, he'd say, though his eyes crinkled in a way that made you think maybe the scarf chose its own scent for each visitor. No one bought the scarf. You couldn't. He wouldn't let it leave the shop. But if you needed it, really needed it, it would find its way to you. The cat, surprisingly, loved it. She'd nap on it when no one was using it, curling into the soft grooves as if the woven threads carried lullabies. She never hissed at it, never scratched it, and once even dragged it across the floor to a young man crying over a cup of bitter tea. He didn't notice at first, but when he did, he laughed through tears. "It smells like my brother's socks," he whispered, "and somehow that helps." Yusiok just refilled his cup and looked away. The scarf seemed to hold memories not as facts, but as feelings. Not images, but emotional shadows. The kind that appear when you close your eyes just right and let yourself breathe through your ribs instead of your chest. It warmed, yes, but not like wool or fire. It warmed in a quieter way, under your collarbone, at the base of your neck, behind your ears. The kind of warmth that reminded you hadn't always felt alone. Sometimes, someone would try to return the kindness. They'd bring in their own scarves to trade, or offer coin or pastries or silk. Yusiok always accepted the gifts, but the original scarf remained, and sometimes, just sometimes, it would vanish for a few days. No one asked where it went. No one needed to. It always came back, folded neatly, still warm. So what did the cat merchant sell? Belonging. The scent of someone you missed, even if you didn't know who that someone was. Now let your shoulders drop. Imagine the soft weight of old yarn wrapped gently around your neck. Let it smell of something familiar, something kind, and drift quietly now into the next story. Some objects just feel different when you hold them. Not expensive, not shiny, just right. The spoon I want to tell you about wasn't for sale. It wasn't displayed or even properly stored. Most days it rested in a jar beside the kettle, its wooden handle slightly warped, the metal bowl portion stained with years of gentle stews and sleepy porridges. Yusiok called it gom, not for any profound reason, just that it looked like a bear somehow, short, sturdy, comforting, or maybe it made you feel like one when you used it. Slow, safe, hungry in a non-threatening way. The spoon had no engravings, no lacquer, just smooth dark wood worn by many thumbs and lips. But here's the thing. If you used gom to stir your soup, even if it was a quick broth with too much salt and not enough heart, it tasted right. Not extraordinary. Not rich. Just like it had always belonged in your mouth. Like you were a child again. Like someone had made it just for you. No one could explain it. A travelling cook once brought in his best bamboo ladle, tried a side-by-side taste test, and declared Yusiok's spoon the clear winner. "Mine tastes like seasoning," he grumbled. "Yours tastes like comfort." Even the monk who took a vow against spice admitted that with gom, even boiled turnip water had nuance. Of course, Yusiok never loaned it out. He let people borrow it for a sip, for a bowl, but it never left the shop. Gom had lived there longer than the cat, some claimed. Longer than the shelves, even. "Found it in an abandoned ferry boat," Yusiok once said. scratching behind his ear, wrapped in a coat, the only thing not wet. No one knew if he was serious, but every now and then a visitor would take a sip using gum and go very quiet, eyes closed, spoon halfway to lips, pausing in some invisible moment only they could see. "That's the taste," they'd murmur. And it didn't matter what was in the bowl, seaweed broth, radish soup, even just rice water. The taste always landed softly behind the heart, like a lullaby hummed through steam. One older gentleman, a former tax clerk, came in every Wednesday just for a spoonful, brought his own soup, sat by the window, used gom, then quietly left, bowing twice. The cat, curious at first, tried to chew the spoon once, got a mild headache and left it alone forever. There was one exception, though. A girl with trembling hands came in, holding a tiny ceramic bowl and a folded note. She didn't speak, just handed Yusyok the bowl and sat down. He poured in hot barley broth, placed gom beside it, and let her stir. She smiled, cried a little, nodded, then left the note behind. It read, "Your spoon gave me back one Tuesday I thought I'd lost." So what did the cat merchant sell that day? The sensation of return, the warmth of soup made by someone who knew what you needed before you asked. Now, let your hands imagine the curve of a worn spoon. Let it dip gently into memory, draw out something familiar and quiet, and let yourself slip slowly into the next story. There was a fan that lived behind the counter at Softpaw Sundries, not displayed, not sold, and never offered unless absolutely necessary. It was old, made of slats of mulberry wood and paper dyed the colour of a quiet sigh, a little crooked, with one rib slightly cracked, and its tassel frayed like a grandmother's favourite bookmark. Yusyok called it chai. No one really knew if it meant anything special, but when you held it and gave it a single flick, it opened with a sound like rustling leaves and an attitude like a counsellor who'd just made tea. Here's the strange part. The fan only worked when you were sad. No, really. Try using it while cheerful, and all it did was stir air like an impatient hand wave. But if you sat down, eyes a bit glassy, heart a little heavy, and gave it a flick, it would catch the breeze in just the right way. A cool, even wind would sweep across your skin, not too strong, not too soft. Just perfect. One young woman came in during the sticky heart of midsummer. Her fiancé had left her a note, 3 characters long and no return address. She hadn't cried. Not really, but her shoulders told the truth. Yusyok didn't ask questions. He placed Che in front of her, open. She picked it up, held it loosely, and flicked it once. The wind that emerged smelled faintly of plum blossoms and clean laundry. She didn't speak, just fanned herself slowly, tears finally falling. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like raindrops on a silent pond. When she was finished, she folded the fan and placed it back. "It knew," she whispered. "How?" Yusyok only shrugged. "It listens." The fan had its own moods. If someone came in pretending to be sorrowful, hoping for a dramatic breeze or a magical moment, it stayed stiff and unimpressed. But for the truly aching, it worked every time. A merchant grieving a lost shipment fanned himself into laughter. An old teacher mourning a dog fanned once and said he remembered the sound of paws on stairs again. Even the cat, though not a fan of moving air, once sat directly beneath it during a passing thunderstorm. The breeze that day smelled like dry wood and calm nerves. People began calling it the empathy fan, but Yusyok insisted it wasn't anything mystical. It's paper and patience, he'd say, folded memories. Occasionally he'd offer it to strangers without saying why, and somehow they always understood. They'd take it gently, give it a flick, and exhale something they'd been holding for far too long. And on one peculiar day, a passing poet declared it the most honest object he'd ever met. "It's the only thing," he said, "that listens without trying to fix me." So what did the cat merchant sell that day? Relief. The quiet kind. A moment of softness blown across the cheek by something that didn't ask questions. Now, feel a gentle breeze brush across your imagination, cool even, scented with memory and late afternoon. Let it carry away one tiny sadness, just one, and drift, now, with lightened breath, into the next story. In the far back corner of soft-pour sundries, beneath a shelf that creaked every time someone walked past it but never collapsed, there sat a jar. A big one, round-bellied. The kind of jar you might expect to find storing stormwater or secrets. It was glazed in dull browns and greens, its lid wrapped with cloth tied tight by something that looked suspiciously like a shoelace. It wasn't labelled. It had no price. But every so often, Yusyok would lift the lid with exaggerated care, as though unsealing something ancient and temperamental. Inside, pickles, or something like pickles. They changed colour, shape, scent, but they were always there. Daikon, radish, lotus root, cucumber. One day someone swore they saw pickled pine cones. Another claimed to have tasted a sliver of eggplant so sour and so perfect it made their left eye twitch for an hour. But the real mystery? The jar never emptied. Yusyok never replenished it, not that anyone ever saw. Yet day after day, pickle after pickle was pulled and plated, and still the briny pile remained, glistening in vinegar like smug secrets. A local pickler, who prided herself on her aggressively salted turnips, once challenged him. "Impossible," she muttered, poking at the jar with a wooden spoon she carried like a sword. "Must be trickery." Yusyok simply offered her a taste. She took a slice, something yellow and translucent, crisp as snapped ice, and chewed. Her eyes widened. She sat down. "This tastes like my mother's wedding day," she said, utterly confused. He nodded. "It's good with barley tea." She returned 3 times that week. The jar became a quiet legend. People whispered it was bottomless. Some believed it was blessed by the kitchen spirits. Others said it was cursed, in the gentle way that made you emotionally reliant on pickled vegetables for spiritual clarity. Yusyok never explained. "It's not infinite," he'd say, tapping the rim. "It's just generous." Children liked the crunch. Travellers liked the tang. A visiting diplomat said it cured his hangover in under 4 minutes. Even the cat seemed intrigued. She never ate from it, gods forbid, but she once perched beside it for nearly 2 hours, watching the bubbles rise and fall as if the jar had tides. One rainy afternoon, an apprentice scholar asked if he could study it for a university essay. Yusyok allowed it. The paper was titled Fermentation as a Philosophical Constant, and it was promptly rejected by his advisor for being too edible. The pickle jar remained, always just full enough, never overflowing, never scraped dry, like it knew when you needed just one more bite, and when you did, it offered a slice that tasted like things preserved, memories, moments, words unsaid but still waiting. So what did the cat merchant sell? A sense of enough. A taste of just what you didn't know you needed, soaked in vinegar and thyme, and drift, with that tang still on your tongue, into the next tale. Tucked behind a curtain of drying herbs, mugwort, wild mint, a few stems of mystery, there was a mirror in soft-pour sundries that didn't reflect quite the way you'd expect. It wasn't especially clear. The silver backing had dulled with time, and the edges held the faint fog of breath long past. The frame was simple pine, no carvings, no lacquer, just the colour of worn footsteps and tea stains. No one saw their current self in the mirror. Instead, when they looked, they saw a moment, a small scene, always quiet, always warm, always them, doing something kind. Not big dramatic kindness, no heroic rescues, just small human gestures. Tying a neighbour's shoe, offering the first bite of a peach, sitting beside someone who was too tired to talk. Yusyok never advertised the mirror. It simply sat there, angled just slightly, as if it had turned its gaze away from the louder parts of the shop. People only found it when they were wandering, not looking for anything in particular, just letting their eyes rest on quiet things. The first person to notice its peculiarity was a paper umbrella maker. She leaned in to fix a loose thread on her sleeve, and instead saw herself handing a bowl of porridge to her sister after a long night of tears, an act she'd entirely forgotten. She stared for a long time. When she turned to Yusyok, she looked different. Not confused, not surprised, just softer. "It remembered," she whispered. He nodded, already pouring tea. From then on, the mirror became a secret comfort. No one spoke of it aloud, as if Naming it would change its nature. People visited it with bowed heads and slow steps. A boy who once stole a rice cake saw himself covering a friend with a jacket during last winter's coldest night. An old fisherman, gruff and stooped, watched as a much younger version of himself gently placed a frog back into the river. A woman with too many regrets saw her own hands braiding her grandmother's hair during the last month of her life. And always, always, the expression on their reflected face was the same. Quiet kindness. The kind that doesn't need thanks. The kind that lives in the fingertips and behind the eyes. The mirror never lied, but it didn't show flaws either. It showed what remained good, despite the cracks. Yusiok claimed he found it at a street market on a day when all the vendors were closed. It was just leaning against a wall, he said, covered in dust and sighs. Even the cat approved. She often sat beside it, tail curled, watching it the way cats do, like it might offer a mouse made of light. No one ever asked to buy it. It wouldn't have worked anyway. Mirrors like that don't travel, they grow roots. So what did the cat merchant sell? Reminders. Reflections of your best self, waiting patiently for you to remember you still carry that version inside. Now, let your breath slow. Picture your kindest act, no matter how small, rising like steam on a cool mirror's surface. Hold it there, let it shimmer, and gently now we step into the next story. There was a drawer in soft pour sundries, wooden, narrow, and slightly stuck on the left side. It squeaked when opened, not unpleasantly, more like the sound of a sleepy gate on a foggy morning. Inside it lived bundles of dry noodles tied with twine. No labels, no jars, just resting, stacked like scrolls of edible wisdom. Yusiok called them sleeper strings. They weren't sold by weight or bundle. They were given, offered rather, when someone arrived with too many shadows under their eyes and too much silence in their shoulders. The noodles weren't flashy. They weren't even especially beautiful. Uneven lengths, some pale like old rice paper, others faintly speckled as if dusted with forgotten herbs. But when boiled for 3 minutes and 30 seconds, exactly according to Yusiok, they produced the kind of broth that tasted like an apology wrapped in a lullaby. A widow once said the steam from those noodles smelled like the part of a lullaby that hums between verses. A fisherman claimed it reminded him of the dream he had the night before his daughter was born. A child who hadn't spoken in 2 days slurped a strand, then declared, "My nightmares went down the drain." That became the phrase, "nightmares down the drain." Locals repeated it as a quiet blessing, and the ingredients? Unknown. Some speculated they were made with powdered lotus root and night dew gathered in silence. Others believed they were kneaded under moonlight by Yusiok himself, who hummed old lullabies into the dough as he worked. One wild rumor claimed the noodles were twisted from strands of dream fog collected at the edge of the marketplace before sunrise. Yusiok never confirmed any of it. All he'd say was they don't work if you rush them. Dreams like broth need to sit for a while. He served them in wide ceramic bowls, slightly chipped at the rim, with mismatched spoons and a side of pickled seaweed that smelled faintly of lavender. No garnish, no salt offered, just the steam rising in swirls, as if teasing out the tangles from behind your eyes. The cat never touched them, but she would often curl near the bowl when they were being eaten, her eyes half-lidded, her purring soft and steady like a second heartbeat. Yusiok warned guests not to talk while eating the noodles. "They're shy," he'd say. "If you speak too loudly, they get stringy." A scholar once ignored that rule, debating Confucian ethics mid-bite, and later reported dreaming only of tangled ropes and forgotten errands. But those who ate quietly, they woke lighter. Not cured, not magically whole, just less heavy. And always the water used to rinse the bowls afterward was poured at the base of a bamboo plant behind the shop. Yusiok said it helped the bamboo sleep too. So what did the cat merchant sell? Unknots. The gentle unravelling of worries you didn't know had tied themselves to your dreams. Now, breathe in the imagined steam of that broth. Let the soft strands of noodle slide through your mind, smoothing what's wrinkled. And slowly, dreamily, we turn the page to the next tale. It sat in a shallow lacquered dish near the till, alone, not grouped with the others. A single button, faded ivory, worn smooth, 4 holes like a face that had forgotten how to frown. Most people didn't notice it. Just one of those trinkets, you might think, cluttering a counter, until you touched it. Because when you touched it, just brushed it even lightly, it remembered you. Your name, your first one. The one whispered to you by someone long ago. Maybe a grandparent with soft hands and a voice like steamed buns. Maybe a sibling you haven't spoken to in years. The one you used to hear shouted across yards and muttered through sleepy mouths. And sometimes it whispered it back. Not aloud, not in the way of voices, but you'd feel it, under your fingertips, across your collarbones, a recognition. Yusyok said it was nothing. Old button from an old jacket, probably not even mine. But he never moved it from the dish, never dusted it, never let the cat play with it, which she tried many times. The one time she batted it under the counter, he spent 20 minutes coaxing it back out with a chopstick and a slice of dried persimmon. The button belonged, and it stayed. People began to visit just to touch it, some skeptically, like they were humorously indulging a local myth. Others with eyes already full of something unspoken. They didn't all react the same. A tired woman placed a finger on it and smiled with such sudden softness that Yusyok paused mid-pour. "Grandfather," she whispered. "He used to say my name like it meant something." A travelling tailor came by and froze the moment he touched it. "No one's called me that since my aunt passed," he said quietly. "Not even I did." It didn't change your name. It didn't assign you a new one. It simply called forth the version of you who once felt safe in the arms of familiarity. Children felt it too. One small boy, sticky with rice flour, touched it and said, "It says I'm still me." Yusyok nodded solemnly, and the button, it never cracked, never changed colour. It warmed slightly under your hand, but only just, like a pebble that had been waiting in the sun for your palm. It wasn't for sale, of course. He once joked, "You can borrow the feeling, but not the button." Occasionally he'd close the shop for 10 minutes and leave the curtain drawn. No one knew why, but those with ears like gossiping pine trees said he was letting the button rest, or perhaps letting it remember itself. The cat, although usually indifferent to ceremony, once brought it a small bean. No one knows what that meant. Yusyok just smiled. So what did the cat merchant sell? A moment of being known, a name you didn't realize you missed, spoken without sound. Now, lay your hand on your chest in the quiet of your blanket. Feel for that hidden button within, the one still stitched to your earlier stories, and with that warmth, press onward into the next chapter. Somewhere near the back wall of soft-pour sundries, wedged between 2 hanging scrolls of poems no one had ever finished reading, there sat a small paper lantern. It looked like any other, round, slightly crumpled, with one side torn and repaired using old book pages. It hung low, almost bashfully, casting no real light. Or at least, not while you were watching. Yusyok called it shy fire. No switch, no cord, no flame, but it glowed, only when ignored. People didn't believe it at first. They'd try to sneak a glance, pretend to look away, but squint just enough to catch it. It never worked. As long as your eyes touched it, even from the corners, it stayed dark, a stubborn moon. But turn your head, lean into a memory, or let your attention wander to a smell, a sound, a thought you hadn't dusted off in years, and suddenly the room behind you would warm. Just a little, like someone had lit a secret. It wasn't a bright glow, not enough to read by, more like the light you feel behind closed eyelids, the kind that lingers when you wake from a comforting dream. A scholar once came in during monsoon season, muttering to himself about logic, laws, and lantern oil. He scoffed when told of shy fire. "It's a trick," he said. "Some mirror, some powder. There's no such thing as observation-dependent flame." Yusyok only smiled and offered him tea. The scholar paced, lectured. Then, exhausted, he turned to look out the window at the rain. The room behind him glowed. When he turned back, it didn't. He stayed for hours, just turning in circles, testing the limits of its quiet game. Finally, he sat, drank the tea and sighed. "I don't understand it," he said, "but I like it." That became the refrain. It glowed for heartbreak, for joy, for soft humming, for long silences where no one knew what to say. Couples sometimes came in and argued gently over rice crackers, never cruelly, just the way people who love each other get tangled. And as soon as they turned from each other, the glow appeared, like a small reminder that their warmth hadn't left, just paused. Children loved it, of course. They'd spin in circles, pretending to catch the light mid-glow, declaring it a ghost or a wish keeper, or the warm thing that lives in stories. One child asked Yusiok if the lantern was alive. "No," he said, "but it listens." Even the cat, aloof as ever, was once spotted basking beneath it, back turned, tail flicking, eyes closed, purring just slightly louder than usual. No one ever asked to buy it. It wouldn't have worked elsewhere anyway. Its light was tied to the rhythm of the shop, to the echo of footfalls and the way the wooden beams sighed when it rained. It didn't illuminate objects, it illuminated feelings. And if you ever walked away from it and felt a sudden warmth across your shoulder blades, it might have been the lantern saying, "I see you, even when you don't." So what did the cat merchant sell? Presence, the light that only reveals itself when you stop trying to see. Now, turn your thoughts away for just a moment. Let your attention drift sideways. Feel the warmth behind your mind like a whisper-lit room, and let yourself glide quietly into the next tale. Tucked away in a drawer behind the shop's biscuit tins, just under the wrapped fig leaves and beside a single moth-eaten glove, lived a small bundle of chalk. It was soft, more dust than stick, with pale colours like faded dreams, ivory, blush, cloud grey, and the sort of blue you only see in the sky when someone you love is leaving. Yusiok called it after chalk. He didn't sell it. In fact, he rarely even showed it. But every now and then, when someone came in looking not for a product but for a pause, a real bone-deep pause, he would quietly slide open the drawer and offer a piece. "You'll need a smooth surface," he'd say, "and a memory." There was a worn slate propped against the shop's back wall, cracked in one corner, smelled faintly of sesame oil and secrets. Visitors who used the chalk never knew what they were going to draw. Their hands simply moved. One woman sketched a teacup with a tiny chip on the handle, the exact cup her grandmother used to serve persimmon tea on windy days. A boy drew the pattern of his dog's fur from 3 winters ago. When he finished, he patted the chalk paw and whispered, "Good boy." A travelling dancer traced the outline of a stage she hadn't seen in 15 years, complete with curtains and the tilt of the second spotlight that always made her nervous. No one taught them, no one corrected them, and when they were finished the drawing would shimmer faintly for a moment, just long enough for a breath, and then fade. Not vanish. Fade. As if returning to wherever memories go when they are no longer needed every day. Some people cried, others smiled like someone had just handed them their favourite song. A few simply bowed, placed the chalk back in the dish, and left without speaking. The chalk didn't draw what you wanted to see. It drew what had already happened. Not the big moments, not the weddings, the partings, the grand declarations. No, it showed the little pieces, the buttons, the sand under a picnic cloth, the way your cousin's hand always rested on the table like it was remembering piano keys. Yusiok used it once, late at night. No one saw what he drew, but when he finished he rested his forehead against the slate for a long time. When he turned back to the shop, his face looked both heavier and lighter. The cat, typically disinterested in sentimental affairs, rubbed her head against the drawer for 3 days afterward, then promptly ignored it again. One visitor left a note. "It didn't show me what I asked for. It showed me what I forgot I missed." And that, perhaps, was the chalk's true magic. It didn't reveal, it reminded. So what did the cat merchant offer that day? Time, in chalk form, brief, dusty, and softer than truth. Now, imagine a line drawn by memory itself. Delicate, unfinished, but enough. Let it trace gently across your thoughts, then fade, like breath on stone, and let us step quietly into the next tale. At first glance, it looked like any other jar of salt, a squat little ceramic pot with a cork lid sitting on a high shelf next to 3 faded labels and a dried turnip no one could explain. But people began to notice strange things about it. For one, Yusyok never reached for it when seasoning anything himself. He only brought it down when a guest brought their own food. "Try this," he'd offer, nudging the salt jar forward with 2 fingers. "Just a pinch." And oh, what a pinch could do. The salt was coarse, each grain irregular, like the language of oceans trying to spell something with foam. The moment it touched a dish, be it soup, porridge, or half-stale dumplings, things changed. Not the flavor, not the temperature, but the truth. Suddenly you knew, instantly, whether the dish was terrible, delightful, rushed, or remembered from someone else's recipe. You couldn't lie to yourself anymore. A proud rice cake seller once salted his own snacks and declared, "Oh no," just like that. His eyes widened, and he admitted the texture was all wrong. "Why did no one tell me?" he asked. Why? Yusyok just offered him tea and a biscuit. Another time, a proud mother of 5 who claimed her broth could heal broken hearts, dipped her spoon after a pinch and frowned. "Too much dried anchovy," she murmured, then added, "I never wanted to make it this way. It was my mother-in-law's version." The salt knew. More accurately, it helped you know it didn't change the food, it changed your relationship to it. A travelling chef once visited, famous in his prefecture, known for ox-bone stew and large hats. He sprinkled the salt onto a spoonful of his own creation, tasted it, and went very still. Then he laughed for 5 minutes. "Ha! It's mediocre. I've been parading mediocre stew for 15 years. He left that day humming, lighter than when he came in. Not everyone found it funny. Some grew quiet. Some scribbled notes furiously. One man left his ladle behind and never cooked again, instead taking up bonsai trimming. And yet the salt didn't judge. It simply clarified. It helped people hear the difference between what you serve and what you hoped they'd taste. The cat didn't like the jar. She once poured it, sneezed, and avoided it ever since. But those who braved the truth it offered, they often returned, not always with food, sometimes just with memories of dishes they'd now prepare differently. One girl returned holding a wrinkled parchment covered in her grandfather's sauce recipe. "I think I can taste what he meant now," she said. Yusyok nodded, returning the jar to its place. "Just a pinch," he repeated. "Too much truth ruins dessert." So what did the cat merchant sell that day? Honesty. Crunchy, crystalline, and best served gently. Now, imagine the texture of one sharp grain dissolving on your tongue. Not harsh, just clear. Let it wash through your thoughts, then melt into silence as we ease into the next chapter. It was small, as jars go, about the size of a plum, squat and round, with a cork stopper tied in place with wax string. It sat on a shelf that no one seemed to dust, between a broken bell and a dried-up ink brush. Its glaze was uneven, sky blue in places, chipped in others, with little golden flecks that looked like giggles if you squinted just right. No one noticed it much at first, but every now and then, when the shop was quiet, after the rain had settled into the wood and the cat had fallen asleep in the crook of the tea shelf, a sound would rise. Not a creak, not a sigh. A laugh, faint, tinkling, not recent but familiar. Visitors would turn and look around, only to find nothing but stillness. Maybe the teacup on the counter had shifted. Maybe the curtain had fluttered. But the laugh, low and warm and somehow just for you, lingered in the corners of the room. That's when Yusyok began to explain. "The jar catches forgotten laughter," he said one day, to a travelling lantern seller who looked especially tired. Not the kind you share on purpose. The kind that sneaks out when you drop something, or when your foot gets stuck in a sandal and someone you love is watching. He claimed it started collecting sounds years ago, completely by accident. The jar had been meant for pickled onions. But one day, while a child was giggling at the way Yusyok's sleeves flopped like wings, the jar was open, and the laugh went in. He didn't believe it at first, but that night while cleaning up he heard it again. The same laugh, faint, coming from the jar. After that he left it open on purpose. It didn't catch all laughter, only the stray bits, the ones with no home. Yusyok said the jar was modest like that. One rainy afternoon, a woman came in soaked and scowling, her shoes squelched. Her hair was an apology to her dignity. Then she heard it. A giggle. Faint. Definitely not hers. It sounded like a 6-year-old finding joy in puddles. She turned to Yusyok. "I think that was my niece," she said. "From 3 summers ago," he nodded, handing her a towel. "Jars have long memories," he said. Over time, people began to come in just to listen. Yusyok would place the jar on the counter, carefully remove the stopper, and let 1 or 2 sounds escape. A bubbling snort, a shy laugh turning into a snicker. Once, a howl of glee that startled the cat off the windowsill. The sounds never repeated. Each was unique. Sometimes they were a little muffled, like the laughter had been buried under blankets. Other times they were sharp and sudden, like someone remembering how to breathe joyfully. No one ever asked to take the jar home. It felt like it belonged to the shop, like it was part of its breath. Children whispered to it on tiptoe. Old men bowed slightly before it, as if greeting an old joke. Even the cat, after months of ignoring it, once tapped it with a paw and looked extremely pleased with herself afterward. So what did the cat merchant sell that day? Echoes of joy, the kind you forgot you'd had. Now close your eyes. Let one soft laugh rise in your memory, uninvited but welcome. Let it swirl in your chest like steam in a cold room and carry you gently into the next tale. It started as a square. Not a fancy one, just plain rice-coloured paper, with one corner stained by what looked suspiciously like soy sauce. It lived on the front counter of soft-pour sundries, nestled between a cracked abacus and a carved wooden beetle that no one ever admitted had a purpose. Yusyok didn't keep it in a box. He left it out in the open, as if it were just another scrap meant for shopping lists or teacup doodles. But it had a personality. It folded itself. Not often, not quickly, but when it did, it made a sound like a very polite sigh. And the rule, it folded when someone nearby told a lie. Not a cruel one, not even a big one, just a little one. The plum wine isn't too sweet. I wasn't crying, just allergies. I've moved on. Each time the paper would twitch, then crease. Just a single fold, sometimes down the centre, sometimes off to one side like a lazy apology. If you were watching, you might catch it mid-crease, reshaping itself slowly, deliberately, like a shy truth waking up from a nap. Most didn't notice, but some did. A man once bragged that his dumplings always sold out by noon. The paper folded immediately into a tiny triangle. He stared at it. "Fine," he muttered. "I eat most of them myself." A young woman claimed she no longer thought about a boy who used to send her pine cones as gifts. The paper curled into a soft curve. "All right," she whispered. "Maybe just sometimes." No one was punished, nothing exploded. The paper didn't scold, it just folded, and the shape it chose was always gentle, never sharp, never mocking. More like it was giving your words a new place to rest, one that fit better. Yusyok once said the paper arrived folded into a swan. He unfolded it out of curiosity, and ever since it had done the rest on its own. "I think it misses its old shape," he explained once, tapping it fondly, "but it won't go back until we stop pretending." The cat, predictably, treated it like a nemesis. She batted it often, but every time she did, the paper held perfectly still, as if it only recognized dishonesty from humans. And yet, when she knocked over a teacup one evening and pretended it wasn't her, the paper folded itself into a tiny ear. Guests began calling it the gentle rebuke. Some asked for copies. Yusyok declined. "It only works if it knows you," he said. It never folded for jokes, never for poems, only when someone tried to hide from their own truth. Over time, people grew oddly fond of it. They'd speak a half-truth, glance at the counter and wait. If it moved, they'd sigh and smile and try again. Less bravado, more honesty. "I do miss her," one man said to the paper, "but I'm still angry." The paper didn't fold. It had nothing to correct. So, what did the cat merchant offer that day? A paper mirror. One that didn't reflect your face, but the shape of what you tried to hide. Now, imagine a page slowly curling in a breeze. Not tearing, just changing shape. Let that movement ease through you, No shame, only softness, and let's slip quietly into the next story. It was small enough to fit in your palm. Smooth, oval, the kind of grey that looked like it might hold secrets about the sea. No markings, no shine, just a single groove worn into its middle, as if centuries of fingers had held it in thought. Yusyok kept it in a basket of similar stones near the door. Most were plain, decorative even, but this one changed. Not dramatically, not with light or sound, but with warmth. The first time someone picked it up and thought of something sweet, not sugar sweet, but memory sweet, it warmed slightly, like it had been waiting in a pocket close to the heart. No one understood why. A schoolteacher once picked it up absent-mindedly while waiting for her order of barley biscuits. As she turned it in her fingers, she remembered the first paper crane her student had given her. Folded lopsided with a red stamp for eyes, the stone warmed. She blinked, smiled, didn't say a word, just placed it back in the basket and left with softer shoulders. From then on, the stone became a quiet ritual. People would stop at the door, hold the stone and allow a single good memory to bubble up. The rules were unspoken but understood. It had to be real. It had to be gentle. It had to be yours. A farmer once held it and remembered his mother's calloused hands braiding onions into ropes. A potter, blind in one eye, felt it warm as she recalled the sound of her father humming while shaping clay. A former thief picked it up, and it glowed faintly as he remembered giving back a wallet he could have kept. One by one, the stone collected these silent sweetnesses, not to keep but to reflect. It never grew hot, just warm, just enough to say, yes, that was yours, that was good. Yusyok never labelled it, never advertised it. If asked, he'd shrug. Just a stone, he'd say, like stories. Sometimes he left it outside the door, resting on a folded hand towel. It was never stolen. Even children seemed to understand. One small boy once kissed it and whispered, "That was for my dog." Even the cat approved. She'd nuzzle it on occasion, especially after napping in the sun. Once she carried it gently, in her mouth, to a corner of the shop where an old man sat weeping. She dropped it beside his hand and walked away. He touched it, closed his eyes, it warmed. After a while, visitors stopped asking what it did. They just paused beside it, cupped it in their hands, and allowed a little joy to surface. Then they left, lighter, sometimes smiling, sometimes tearful, but always warmer. So what did the cat merchant sell? A return to a moment of goodness small and true that still lived in the folds of your memory. Now, curl your fingers gently in your imagination. Picture a smooth stone resting in your hand. Feel it grow warmer, not hot, not urgent, just kindly warm. And let that quiet joy glow softly as we walk into the next story. On the lowest shelf in the quietest corner of soft pour sundries, tucked behind a basket of tangled string and a tin of dried plum pits, sat a stack of envelopes, handmade, the paper rough in some places, soft in others. The colour of linen hung in the sun too long. They weren't for mailing, not really. Yusyok simply called them letters to keep. There was nothing fancy about them. No gold edging, no seals, no embossing, just plain folds, a simple flap and a thin line of old glue that hadn't stuck in years. Unless, of course, you meant what you wrote. That was the thing. The envelope only sealed when you meant it. Not when you tried, not when you hoped. Only when your heart and your hand had finally said the same thing at the same time. A woman once came in and bought 4. She returned 2 days later with all 4 still open. She placed them quietly back on the counter. "Turns out I didn't mean it yet," she whispered. Yusyok nodded and offered her a warm rice puff instead. The envelope didn't need fancy pens or poems. Some people sealed them with nothing but a sentence. "I forgive you. I remember the way your hand twitched when you lied. I wish I had danced." When the envelope believed you, the flap gently curled down and pressed itself closed with a soft sighing sound. Not a snap. Not a click, just closure. One traveller stayed in the shop for hours, scribbling and tearing, pages scattered, ink smeared, brows furrowed. Then finally, he wrote 6 words. folded the paper, slid it in and waited. The envelope sealed. He bowed to it, left without a word. Yusyok never asked to read them. He didn't need to. That wasn't the point. Some left the envelopes behind, placing them in a wooden box near the lantern stand labelled simply unsent. Others took them home, tucked them into drawers or shoes or old coat pockets. A few buried them near rivers. One was rumoured to have been placed in the hollow of a tree. No matter what happened afterward, the sealing was enough. It was proof, somehow, that your feelings, your real feelings, had found their shape. The cat naturally enjoyed sitting atop the sealed ones. She never interfered with open envelopes. It was as though she could smell doubt and preferred to nap in sincerity. Yusyok claimed the envelopes were made by a retired calligrapher who'd run out of people to write to. She folds her silence into the paper, he said once, tapping the corner of one. That's why they know. People began requesting them quietly. I need one, they'd say voice low, for something I should have said before the ferry left. I need one, said a boy, to thank someone who'll never read it. I need one, said a woman, to remind myself. And every time Yusyok would nod and slide an envelope forward like a slow-moving wave. So what did the cat merchant sell? Permission. To say something real to no one, to everyone, to yourself. Now, imagine the feel of rough paper folding gently in your lap. Picture words flowing out, not perfect but honest. And listen, can you hear the faintest sigh of a seal being formed? Let that sound carry you quietly into the next story. There it sat, not in a basket or bin, but alone, on a small wooden hook near the exit of Soft-Paw Sundries. A single sock, striped, soft as steamed dumpling skin, a faded coral colour with a thumbprint-sized hole neatly stitched on the heel, and a tiny piece of dried lavender tied to the cuff. It wasn't sad. If anything, it looked proud to be on its own. People often asked Yusyok where its mate was. He'd shrug and say, gone off to find itself. Some socks need space. He claimed it had been part of a pair once, maybe even several pairs. But each time it found a companion, it eventually reappeared alone, slightly changed. Sometimes a new button sewn in, sometimes smelling faintly of pine or fireplace ash. It was never lost. Just between relationships. Visitors were oddly drawn to it. I had a sock like that once, they'd say, softest one, wore it to sleep on the train. I remember a pair just like that, gave them to someone I shouldn't have. I kept mine under the pillow after she left. There was something about it, how it drooped just slightly, how it seemed to hum quietly when the breeze from the door touched it, as though it had stories, travels, pillow fights, fireside naps. Children tried to adopt it. Yusyok gently declined. It's not ready, he'd say. One woman left a small matching sock in return. If it changes its mind, she said. Yusyok placed the new sock beside it, but by morning it was gone. The original remained with a fresh sprig of thyme tied near the toe. The cat, who hated all footwear on principle, tolerated this one. Once she dragged a dried fish cracker underneath it and left it there like an offering. Another time she slept beneath it on a rainy evening, as if it offered protection from lonely dreams. It wasn't just a sock, of course. It was a memory of all the things we carry one of. Hopes, farewells, letters unsent. Of the comfort in things slightly worn and forever imperfect. Of how sometimes being incomplete is exactly what makes something precious. Yusyok never washed it, never repaired the threadbare spots. Let it be, he said once. Some things need their softness earned. People began to leave tiny things in its cuff. Notes, petals, crumbs of mooncake, once even a stone with the word almost carved into it. And still the sock stayed. Gentle, ready, not waiting, just there. So what did the cat merchant offer that day? Companionship. Not through matching, but through presence. Now, imagine fabric against your ankle, slightly worn, warm from memory. Let it comfort you in its asymmetry. And now, dear listener, we tiptoe softly into our final tale. High above the shop door, nearly hidden in the rafters, hung a bell. It was small, just the size of a walnut, brass gone soft with age, tied with a length of fraying blue cord. It didn't move in the wind, it didn't chime with passing footsteps. Even when someone pushed the door too fast and rattled the beams, the bell remained silent. It rang only once, and only ever when someone left something behind. Not something physical, not a coat or a bag of tea. No, it rang when someone walked out the door carrying a little less sorrow or guilt or weight, when they left behind a piece of worry that had long since worn out its welcome. It wasn't loud. It was a sound so quiet it felt like being tapped on the heart from the inside. A soft ting, like a memory letting go of your sleeve. Most people never heard it, but the ones who needed it always did. A grandfather who brought in his last letter to a friend he'd never forgiven. He sipped yuja tea, folded the letter, and left it with Yuseok. As he stepped into the alley, the bell let out the faintest sound, bright as morning rice. He paused, smiled, kept walking. A girl who spent 3 afternoons in the shop trying to forget a boy who once promised her a basket of plum blossoms. On the 4th day, she sat silently for an hour, said thank you to no one in particular, and stepped outside. Ting. She looked up, eyes wide. It finally let go, she whispered. The bell rang maybe once a week, sometimes twice, never more. It never rang for arrivals, only departures. Sometimes Yuseok noticed, sometimes not. If he heard it, he simply nodded and placed a biscuit near the windowsill for the sound, for the absence, for what had left the room that would never return. The cat always noticed. She'd flick her ear and shift slightly, acknowledging the chime in her own feline way, as if cataloguing emotional change was part of her job. No one asked to see the bell up close. No ladder was placed beneath it. Some believed it would lose its power if examined. Others simply chose to believe it had always been there, ringing for centuries of unburdenings. Yuseok never claimed it was magic. Just a sound for something leaving, he once said. And sometimes we don't even know what that something was. Over time, visitors stopped asking about the bell. They just came in, sat down, ate a biscuit, wrote a letter, sighed a memory, smiled at a scarf, whispered to a spoon, and when they left, they sometimes heard it. Ting. And walked a little lighter. So what did the cat merchant offer, finally? Release. Gentle, wordless. The sound of something old letting go of its grip. Now, dear listener, let the silence deepen in your chest. Picture that little bell swaying once, barely a breath, and sounding softly not in your ears, but somewhere just beneath your collarbones. And let that be our final note. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. Perhaps, in some corner of your mind tonight, you'll find yourself stepping quietly into that little shop in Old Hanyang, the one with the painted cat, the soup-scented candle, the envelope you finally sealed. If you drifted off during our journey, let me know below. Tell me what story you remember, if you remember at all. And if this quiet space brought you comfort, tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right. Until next time, my friend, sleep well, sleep warm, and good night. Soft Whisper sign off. Shh.